Hello everyone. In our previous lecture, we discussed about CSS Flexbox, in which we talked that Flexbox only allows one dimension to be controlled by using various properties in its container or in its items. So we said that in order for Flex to work, we needed to provide display Flex property to the container element and then provide what kind of other properties can be combined with along with that, right? And similar to the case in Flexbox, Grid also will be doing the same. So it is also based on the container system. So one container, and then you have different item or different items to control through that container. And also we discussed that in a Flexbox, everything is either in x-axis or in the y-axis. So if an item is maintained in an x-axis, so all of the items will follow that direction. Whereas if you have structured your Flexbox to be in y-axis or in this cross-axis, then every item will be arranged in that format. However, there are some exception to that, because if you use wrap, for example, if you're using item wrap or flex wrap, then the content will pass on to the next line, giving you a false sense that it might be two, or it might be in control of like both the axes, but it's not the case. So in case of flex grid layout, we'll be defining the x-axis as well as the y-axis. Okay, so there is a summary of how the history of web layouts has been dealt with. So at the beginning, no layout with just plain HTML, and then we started doing with the tables by combining or the merging cells of a table, just to merging tables or merging cells, and frames where you keep define multiple HTML pages for different section of the or document. And CSS, when CSS started, we started using the block and inline elements, and which we have done in our previous lectures before the midterms. So we discussed about the block inline elements, the floats positioning, as well as the recently we discussed about Flexbox, which was only one dimensional. Now grid layout is much more advanced than Flexbox, and then it works very well with Flexbox as well. But grid layout provides you a sense of two dimension and giving you more control over the layout itself. Okay, but before we continue with grid layout, we need to understand what are the some terms that are used in a grid, in a grid layout. So grid basically is a parent container. Like in the Flexbox, a parent container controls all the items, or you can control all the items through the parent element. However, there can be specific properties just only for the items as well. And the grid line, it basically makes up the grid, and these are all horizontal or the vertical lines. So in this case, if you were to dissect a simple area by lines, so those are called grid lines. And grid cell is a space between any four grid lines. So in this case, the one that is marked in yellow is a cell that is formed by the intersection of four different lines. Okay. And grid track is a horizontal or vertical space between any two grid lines. So in this case, the two grid lines, right? So grid track may be, in this case, we are considering the row version, in which the two lines, the space between two lines, are a grid track. So it's basically defining which column or which row it is. In other terms. And grid area is basically the combination of grid tracks or grid cells, and grid gap is space between two columns or between columns or rows. So to understand this better, rather than just looking at these diagrams, we'll do a demonstration where we can easily find out what all of these terms mean. And another thing that we need to understand about the grid layout is that it can arrange content in HTML semantically, like we have introduced HTML5 to introduce a new semantic elements like header, footer. In such a way, grid also provides our CSS to be semantic. And by semantic, I mean that you can allow the naming convention, or you can allow to name different grid components, and it's more understandable. Okay, and it can also be positioned in any way and in any order, like we have done in Flexbox. By providing a simple CSS property called order, we could rearrange the order as was defined in the HTML. But in case of grid layout, you can arrange or you can order them in both the x-axis as well as the y-axis. So for creating a grid layout, there are certain things that we need to understand. First being the container element, which has to be defined as display grid, and this is like in Flexbox when we did display as flex. So in case of grid layout, we are going to display the container element as grid, and then the second would be setting up the columns and rows, and by defining widths. And in this case, we can define widths by any of the measures that we have taken before. For example, either you can do it in ems, percentages, pixels, or any units for that matter. You can define that. However, the one that is more used more often for grids is called FR, and that's the fraction of the unit, right? And the way we define the columns or rows is by these properties called grid template columns and grid template rows. So grid template columns will in this case will follow one fraction and then a two fraction and one fraction. So your entire screen or your container in this matter is defined to be of four fraction units, and out of those four, the first column will take space of one fraction, the last column will take space of one fraction, and the one in the middle will take as much as double of what individual of the first and the last is. So it's basically taking two fractions. And also you can define by using percentages. So in this case, the columns has been defined by fraction and the rows has been defined by percentage. Okay, but what it means in this both cases are the same. For example, a one fraction, two fraction, and one fraction basically makes up four, and in this case you are dividing in a similar fashion. So this might be inconsistent with one fraction, two fraction, and one fraction. Just the unit is different, but the meaning or meaning is the same in this case. So what happens with the first line over here, grid template columns, is that you are dividing your container element, your container, into three columns and three rows. So the first column being one fraction, the second being two fractions, and the third being one fraction. And the same way for the columns, sorry, for the rows, you have the first row to be of 25% of the container, the second row to be of 50% of the container, and third row to be 25% of the container. So once you have set up the rows and columns, we can now start placing the content in specific grid areas. Okay, so the grid areas may be a combination of maybe a single cell or a combination of multiple cells, right? So, and the way we can use grid areas is we can also define them through the names of grid lines, or we can create a grid map out of that. Okay, so how we'll do this, I'll be discussing this on the next video, but for now, for today, we'll be only looking at how we structure the grid, how we create a grid template, and how we can position each items on their own, right? So basically what you need to understand here is that the first step of display grid and the grid template columns, grid template rows, and notice that all of these properties has to be defined in the container element, not the item element. Okay, now about the unit that we are going to use for grid basically is called fraction of a free space of the grid container. So in this case, if your container is how much of the space your container is occupying, out of that you are going to define three columns of equal width. Okay, so this is basically giving the width, and this in this rows you are basically giving the height in terms of percentage. And so what this will do is basically set each grid item into 1/3 of the grid container. And so now we have done this basic requirements for a grid. Let's go for demonstration, and during the in the demonstration I'm going to use the same files that I've given you in the previous lecture, that is the Flexbox demo lecture. So you can download if you want to follow along with the video, so you can download the FlexStart, the zip file that I had uploaded earlier, and instead of that we are going to change it to grid layout demo. So I'm just going to rename this rename the title to grid layout. And notice that now once you have done, I'm just going to open it up. So this is basically how it looks, our website, how it looks right now. Okay, with one main container being the three call, and the items of these three calls to be of call 1, call 2, and call 3. So that's what basically it's being displayed right now. Okay, and now the first thing, as suggested in the CSS in the presentation file, is that you have to have the main container element display as grid. So in this case, the main container ID for now is 3 call. So I'm just going to copy and paste it over here and define this as display grid. Okay, so this display grid, now if you have added it and then if you refresh, you will not be seeing any changes. There will not be any changes until and unless you specify a specific template for that container. And again, you have to understand that this is for only the container. So if you were to define other elements after this container, the display grid will not be applied to that, right? For example, if I create another section here, okay, so the display grid will not be applied to that, since this section is out of the main, the 3 call section. So now display grid, once you've applied that, the next thing we need to do is apply either rows or columns. So in this case, we only have 3 divs, so we'll work out with only columns for now. And for defining the columns, you have a property called grid and template columns. So if you want to display this in 3 columns, what we need to do is basically define it as 25%, or give a particular give width, okay, and 50% and 25%. This is in line with what is shown in the presentation file. So once we have this, the first column is going to take 25% of the width of the container, 50% of the width of the container, and again 25% of the width of the container. So you can see here the middle column is basically taking 25% of the width. And now if you were to define here, say that the width of this to be 50%, okay, so now you are taking only 50% of the screen, and whatever um, property that we have specified with the grid template columns is applied to the container element, not the entire body. So this 50% specifies that take the space 50% of the parent div, that is in this case is body, and the grid template columns is going to take only 25%, 25% of this 50%. So you can see here that only half of the screen has been occupied. And just to make some clear visual distinction, I'm going to add some colors right now. So, and for column 1, now I'm just going to add these the CSS that I've created to 3 separate columns, so we have a proper visual distinction. And I'm just going to name them here. And when you're adding any classes, make sure you have a space in between the class names. So in this case, call1 is one of the class and pink is the other class. Similar goes to here. Call2 is one of the class and yellow green is the other one. And we haven't added any CSS to all call1, call2, and call3 classes, but we'll soon be adding them. Now once you have added these properties, so we are only changing the background properties here, right? So you should be able to see that right now. So again, 25%, 50%, 25, and to be more precise here, I'm just going to remove this width here, so that it's taking up the whole screen. But it was just to make you understand that the width that is taken over by the column layout elements is only the width of the container, not the whole screen. Now to make some distinction here, since as these texts are very close to the border, I'm going to add some paddings to the div elements. So to do that, we have 3 col, and then the div, each of the div elements, and padding of 1 ems. So basically now we have a separation, right? So once I've said that, now the format that we have defined is that there will always be a 3 column, and the first column is always going to take 25%, the second 50, and then the third 25. Now what if we have more than just these 3 divs? Okay, so let's say that I'm just going to copy div 2 and div 3, the second and the third div, and I'm going to copy and paste this just outside of like we have, so that we have 5 divs. So we have, now I've copied and pasted the 2 divs here, right? So what happens now? And remember that we have only defined 3 columns, but we have defined 4 divs, and this template columns will take any divs into consideration, the any immediate div here. So we have 5 divs. Now that's going to structure it as, save it, and you should be able to see that some changes here. So what is happening in this case is that every div element you are going to define will be set in this format. For example, we have 5 divs, so basically the first div is going to take 25%, the second would be 50%, and then the third would be 25%, and then the divs that would continue afterwards will again start cycling from the first part here. So the fourth div, that is with the color yellow green, would be 25%, and then the second one or the fifth one would be 50%. Now if I were to add another div here, so let me just copy this div, call to div, and add it at the end, so making it 6 divs in total. Now you should assume that the last div here is going to take up the space of 25% with the color yellow green, and the title should be call2, right? So if I save this, then you should be able to see the changes here. So you have it here, so you have call to basically, and this cycle will repeat if you copy and paste. Okay, so if you create another 3 divs, so I'm just going to, again, just for the sake of adding more divs, I'm going to add the first 3 divs again, and what you should see is basically 3 other divs repeated. Okay, and no matter whatever number of divs you are going to create, it will follow this pattern because this is a template of the grid that we have defined. Okay, now the other property for us was grid row, that is grid template, sorry, rows, and let's say I'm defining it as 1 frame and 2 frames and 1 frame. Okay, so what happens in that case? So basically the height of it, you can see that the second width over here, right? The second part of this is, now in terms of columns, just as a screenshot here. Sorry, I'm not getting the screenshot, just give me a second. So in this screenshot, so what I mean by that is the first one, when we defined a column of 25%, 50%, and 25%, so this is in terms of call, right? In terms of call, for example, this is 25%, and this is 50, and this is 25, right? And again, what we defined, and this applies for each of the columns, so 25%, again 25%, and 50% and 25%. Now when we define the rows, so while defining the rows, we separated that to be of 25%, 50%, or 1 frame, two frames and one frame. So this is how it's being applied. So this is basically one frame, this is two frames, and this is again one frames. Okay. So this is how it's going to be applied. So the rows, as you can see, one frame that's taking a small space, two frame it's taking the double of the space, and then the third space it's taking one frame of the space. And so that's basically how you are creating multiple grids here, right? So for the column, for the grid, sorry, for the column as well as for the row. So for the sake of simplicity, I'm just going to remove this grid for now, and once I've removed, you should be able to see the changes here, that the second uh, row, it's again gone back to its original height. So in the previous case, or in the screenshot that I can show you, that because we mentioned that as two frames, the height changed from it's taking double the width, double the height, okay, and which has been removed because we remove the width part, or sorry, the template rows part. Okay, now as I said earlier, it's better always to use fractions rather than percentages, and that would come into play like when you add gaps. So the other thing that we're going to study is grid gap. Okay, you can have either grid row gap or grid column gap, but I'm just going to have a uniform gap all over the grids elements. So grid gap is basically providing a gap in between the two cells elements. So you have 1 ems of space in this line, 1 ems of space in this line, again 1 ems in this and in the row section as well. So this is how you can separate each individual items. So just for the sake of simplicity, if you just add okay, so it's going to only create gap in between the rows. So if you look at the properties here, I've given a grid row gap that is 1 ems. So you do not have a gap in between the columns, but only in between the rows. So if I were to change this from row to column, and you would not see the change, you would not see the gap in between the rows, but instead only in the column. Now in the 3-column layout, in our basically when we started with float, you had to give a margin, right? So in terms of grid, you can simply add a grid gap only to the column, and then you would get the desired result. Okay, so that's one way of doing it. Now one thing that you need to notice is that once we added the grid gap, there's a scroll bar coming up, and then your text or your grid boxes are getting out of the bounds of the main screen. So that is one of the disadvantages of using percentages. So when you combine that with gap, you basically do not get the desired result of putting that in a single or in the adjusted space. So if I were to convert this from a percentage based to a frame based, say 1 frame, 2 frame, and 1 frame again, which basically is the same as in percentages, but the difference that you'll notice in this case is that this is occupied all within the container element itself. It's not getting out of the screen. Okay, so whenever the gap is mentioned, and whenever you have that combined with also the padding that is given um, provided here, so it generally tends to get out of the screen. So that's why it's better always to use fractions for a grid widths or grid heights. So once we're done with that, and then perhaps you understand now how a grid template can be defined, whether in terms of a grid column or grid rows, and also how you can define the gaps in between the templates. Okay, now other thing that we need to do is about the height of the rows. Okay, now let's say that I'm getting back to a 3-column layout and only 3 divs here. So I'm removing all the unnecessary divs right now. So we have 1 column, 2 column, and 3 column. So in this case, I'm just going to add some contents, or going to copy and paste the paragraph, the lorem ipsum paragraph here. so we have multiple contents, right? So this is how the content is adjusted here. Now you can see that as many contents as I add here on this paragraph, you should be able to see that the height changes according to the highest width that is being occupied. Okay, and that's what we intended to do in our 3-column layout as well, and that's how simple it is by using grids, right? Now also in the flexbox, when we discussed about the flexbox, I introduced you with flexbox within a flexbox within a flexbox. So we are going to do the same in here, and then I'll show you some other template techniques or the template column techniques that can be used. So in that case, I'm just going to create multiple or an inner div, inner flex here, that is in the second column. I'm going to do everything in this call to, and here I'm going to create a section, a div, simply a div, and I'm going to provide it as ID as inner grid. Okay, and instead here I'm going to create multiple divs. For set box, and let me just copy and paste this multiple times. So we have 6 boxes now, and I'm just going to provide some styles to them. So dot box, before that let me just add the display properties here. Okay, and so for the inner grid, the class name is, or the ID is inner grid, and similar to what we have done earlier, to display that as grid you need to do display grid, and again you need to provide the structure or the template for that. So you have grid column template columns of maybe say 2 frames and 3 frames. Okay, so this basically eventually what it will do is you have 6 boxes here. So the first box will be 2 frames, and then the second box will be 3 frames. That will be applied for the upcoming divs as well, the divs that are that comes after. So you have box 1, box 2, since we have divided only 2 columns, right? So only the width matters in this case, is that the first width is 2 frames and then the second width is of 3 frames, right? And then you have 6 boxes here. So to have some visual distinctions, I'm just going to provide a background for them, that is for dot box. I'm just going to create background of white. So for each boxes I'm providing the background of white. Right now what we see is that everything is black, and sorry, everything is white, and I'll tell you why this is so. And also I'm just going to apply a background for the inner grid. So that's why you know like how much space is taken by the by the div sorry, by the container, and how much space is being taken over by the items of that container. So box 1 to 6 has that specified, that is being described by white, and then the entire grid is in the fuchsia color. Now, to have some separation, or the way you can even do some column structure is that, let me add it here. Okay, so if you say that there is another format you can do if you want it to repeat in multiple times, so you can do a repeat, and so you can have maximum of, let's say, 3 and 1 fr. Okay, instead of typing in 1 fr, 1 fr, and 1 fr, so if you do this, so that's basically going to create of 1 frame each. Okay, when you specify with repeat, so in this case, how many columns, and then what is the repetition format. Okay, and so I'm just going to provide a grid cap again, so that there's a distinction between the divs. So you have grid caps. Now, to identify other things, some of the things that we need to discuss is about the justify items. Like we have done arrangement of each of the divs in Flexbox. So here, justify items, and the properties that you can add with the justify items are left, center, right, and stretch. So what happens if you just do left? You can see here that, and like we studied in Flexbox, so you have a flex start, flex end. In the same way, you have a grid, starting of the grid and the end of the grid element. So in this case, box 1 is from the start, so it's taken from the left end. And when you are taking about the for example, about justify items, so eventually you are looking at the horizontal alignment. Okay, not the vertical alignment, but the horizontal alignment. So what I mean by that is, if you were to see in this cell here, and I type something, right, so you can see here that these are the alignments, as you can see in Excel file. Maybe it's better for you to understand. If you are using this align left, align right, align right, so that is basically equivalent to justify items. Okay, and if you are looking at these three, like align from the top, align at the center, and align at the bottom, so that is basically defined by align items properties. So as you can see, so these are two properties that you need to understand. One is justify items, and another one is align items. Okay, so in this case, so these are the things that you need to understand. When you are doing a justify items, left, right, or center, you are aligning in horizontal format. Whereas if you are aligning in the center or aligning through the vertical alignment, then you are using alignments as start, end, or center. Okay. Now, what happens in this case? So I'm just going to remove this for a while now. Cut. So justify items, you have set it as a left. So your content started at the left. If you were to add it as a right, so whatever the space is occupied for that particular component or for that particular item, so it's starting from the right. And if you have it as a center, so So there you have it. Now your content is in the form of center, and by default the value is stretch. So whatever the space is available, it's going to be occupying that. So this is how a stretch will work, and this is basically justifying items. And again, we haven't looked at the properties that are to be defined in the items, but instead we are looking only at the properties that are being defined in the container element. Okay, and align items similarly. Um, so let's just start. Okay. And before I demonstrate you with this align start, so we need to understand, or it will not show until and unless like you have a proper amount of gap in between them. So I'm just going to create a grid auto rows. Okay, and in grid auto rows, this is how you can define the height of the that particular row. And you can even have, for example, if you say this is a 500 pixels, so this is going to specifically take the height of the row elements to be of 500 pixels. So you can see that it's 500 pixels that has been occupied, right? Okay, and if you were to say like 100 pixels, so then basically you're occupying 100 pixels. You can see that this is the height. Okay, and also if you do not want, if you want something to be taken automatically, then you can even give a range of a minimum or maximum value. So that would be min max, and 100 pixels is the minimum value, and maximum can be anything that is taken over by the space. So if you define it as auto, so that is going to take the auto space, but minimum value criteria has to be met. So for example, if I were to add this content in box 1 here, okay, just as a demo, so you can see that the height is being extended here. So whatever the automatic value is going to be, so it is going to take that, right? So because the space, or because the content is greater than the 100 pixels, so it is going to take more than that. If it is less, content, then it's going to take 100 pixels as its default height, whereas if it's more, then it's going to scale automatically. But if, let's say that you do not provide this min max, and then just give a absolute value of 100 pixels, so then your content is going to get out of the system, right? So you can see that the content is being cut. So the way, one of the solution to that is by using a minimum and the maximum value. In this case, that is 100 pixels. Okay, so you have that. Now if you try to do the align items, so for align items, let me just have it as end. So you can see that it's going from the bottom, right? So align items from the bottom, and this you'll be able to see only when there is a difference between the heights. Okay, if your height was simply plain, like all the heights were equal, then it's difficult to see. But you have a bigger height, then it's easier for you to access the one in the row. And again, now if you do the center, align item center, then you can see that the content is being in the center. Notice that you only find the difference in the first row, because the second row all the heights are equal, so you're not finding any difference there. Okay, but if you were to change the content, let's say that I'm just changing the content for box, or the sixth div here, so you would see the change here as well. Okay, so until and unless your height property is not properly defined, it's difficult to identify what is the difference being applied through align items, because it is aligning the items vertically. So you need to have a proper amount of space. Whereas justify items is basically horizontal alignment. Okay, and again, if you want to do it as center, so this is how you can centralize the content, like we have seen in Flexbox how to centralize the content, right? So this is how you can centralize the content, by giving justify items as center and align items as center. Okay, this is basically vertical alignment.